The podcast you're about to hear includes the story of a Katzie man named Slumach. Members of the Katzie First Nation have been instrumental in us telling the story properly. We acknowledge that the story of Slumach originates from the ancestral lands of the Katzie people. What you're about to hear, you may find graphic and violent in nature. Listener discretion is advised. In March 1811, a teenager named Thomas McKay arrived at what would become Astoria, Oregon, aboard a 290-foot American merchant ship called the Tonquin. The Tonquin had sailed from New York all the way around the southernmost tip of South America and up the Pacific coast to the mouth of the Columbia River. The mission of the ship's captain, crew, and passengers was to build a fortified fur trading post in the Pacific Northwest. German-born, New York-based John Jacob Astor was America's first multimillionaire, and his Pacific Fur Company competed directly with Great Britain's Hudson Bay Company in North America's first gold rush, the fur trade. Those who controlled the fur trade controlled the Pacific Northwest, and Britain's former colony, the United States, was gunning to be number one. Thomas McKay's maternal grandmother was from the Kru First Nation. His father was a white fur trader who had been somewhat successful working for first the Northwest Company on the Canadian side of the border, then for the newly formed Pacific Fur Company. This is how Thomas and his father found themselves in this contested but mostly unexplored wilderness. The Tonquin's occupants included Americans, Native Hawaiians, Iroquois, and other indigenous people from the East, as well as French Canadians and Scots. They were charged with the construction of Fort Astoria. In June 1811, as the trading post began to take shape, the Tonquin set sail for Vancouver Island, a mere 300 kilometers to the north, to trade for pelts. Thomas stayed behind, while his father sailed onward to manage the Tonquin's cargo. When the ship arrived at Clayoquot Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island, the captain began onboard negotiations with the Kalaalleq people, represented by a respected elder experienced in trading with foreigners. But the captain didn't like the exchange rate, 5 blankets for 1 animal pelt, and the elder wouldn't budge. In a violent outburst, the captain rolled up a pelt and hit the elder in the face. Naturally, this did not sit well with the Kalaalleq, but after commiserating, they offered another price, 3 blankets and a knife for each pelt. The captain accepted, but then, when each indigenous man had a blade in hand, they attacked, killing all but 4 of Tonquin's crew members, including the captain and Thomas McKay's father. 3 of the crew escaped the ship in a rowboat during the chaos. They were found on land and killed. The remaining, severely wounded crew member remained on board and lit the ship's gunpowder magazine, blowing the Tonquin to smithereens and killing dozens of the Kalaalleq. The only surviving passenger was the ship's interpreter, a member of the Quinault Nation of what is now Washington State. He somehow made it back from Fort Astoria to alert the settlers of the disaster. Not only had several of their friends, colleagues, and family members died, but the destroyed ship held months' worth of provisions for the settlement's survival, which included 15-year-old Thomas McKay, now orphaned. The first Astorians to operate the fort survived the first winter of 1811 to 1812, then the war and subsequent sale of the settlement. And legend has it that while at Fort Astoria, which eventually came under the control of the Hudson's Bay Company, young Thomas heard about the treasures of a shipwreck believed to be the Spanish galleon Santo Cristo de Burgos. For years, Thomas visited the nearby Neocani Mountain with a shovel in hand, digging and searching obsessively every spare moment he had. Then one day, he just got up and walked away. Thomas quit his job as a trapper and explorer for the Hudson Bay Company and just disappeared. But he wasn't gone for good. Many years later, before the gold rushes in California and BC of the mid-1800s, Thomas resurfaced. He settled with his wife and children on a farm along the Willamette River in Oregon, and he seemed strangely flush with cash. He wasn't flashy. He didn't parade around with a set of gold dentures or a pair of matching black stallions like a volcanic someone we know. But he never seemed worried about money at a time when it was all most people worried about. We can't help but wonder, did Thomas McKay find the Spanish gold from the Santo Cristo de Burgos? And did any of it find its way into Slumach's hands 50 years later? I'm Kru Williams, and this is Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold. Episode 11, Jack Mould and Slumach's Gold. If the stories about Thomas McKay are true, he was one of the lucky ones. He seemed to have found some type of fortune while being a trapper, farmer, and frontiersman. True, he only lived until his early 50s, and unlike Volcanic Brown, there's no documented proof of his wealth in our research. Still, all legends start with a kernel of truth, no matter how distorted the story becomes over the years. So, Thomas could have found something. Did Thomas escape a curse? And could the words Nica memlus my memlus harken back to a time centuries before Slumach? In this episode, we'll dive back into the curse, be it ancient or more recent, of wrecked ships or vanished treasure hunters. We'll also look into Jack Mould's life and his relentless search for gold, Spanish gold. Slumach's gold, Volcanic Brown's gold, anybody's gold, at any cost, even if it meant paying the ultimate price. Historian Scott Williams is one of the first people to investigate the wreck of the Santo Cristo de Burgos, and in the last episode, he shared that there are various stories that have merged and morphed into the legend of the Spanish gold of Neocani Mountain in Oregon. The story states up to 3 Spanish ships, at least one a pirate ship, and certainly one of them, the Santo Cristo de Burgos, ran aground in the shadow of the mountain. The survivors of the wreck were said to have rowed their treasure ashore in a large chest and buried it on the side of the mountain. To make sure that the indigenous peoples of the region didn't bother looking for their hidden treasure, they killed an enslaved man and buried him on top of it. Apparently, the plan was to come back at a later date to reclaim the treasure. But what keeps the legend alive is that apparently they never came back. Like Slumach's lost gold mine, Neocani's mountains legend has its share of deaths and disappointments. After Thomas McKay's presumed success in the mid-1800s, disappointment most definitely followed the rest. In the 1860s, settler and surveyor Hiram Smith dug for treasure on the mountain and passed on his passion and expertise to his son, Patrick. As we've seen with our BC father-son team, Charlie and Jack Mould, it was Charlie who passed on his passion about Spanish gold in the Pacific Northwest to Jack, who never let it die. In Oregon, Patrick Smith searched the face of the mountain for a few decades, especially after he found some stones engraved with markings and arrows, which were thought to indicate where the treasure was buried. He found none. Then, in 1931, in another weird parallel, another father and son team dug a large hole on the Oregon mountain in search of the hidden treasure. Tragically, the hole caved in, killing them both. By the 1940s, while some stories of hoodoo gold in the pit circulated in the pulp magazines, and a spunky 60-year-old Mrs. Al Jenkins was one of the few women prospectors on the hunt for Slumach's gold. Treasure hunters at Neocani were using bulldozers and drills and digging up pits up to 125 feet deep into the side of the Organ Mountain. Never mind the cultural impact on the folks who had lived there for thousands of years, or the environmental damage to the landscape, even if state laws protect the land from pillage. In another parallel between legends, as Stu Brown's advanced age and failing health made any further attempts to the Pit Lake region impossible in 1989, in late 1990, a man searching for treasure in one of Neocani Mountain's dangerous caves was washed out to sea by a wave and drowned. But the legends persist, and so do curses. In Oregon, it's fueled by bits from the Santo Cristo de Burgos that washed up on beaches for a couple of centuries at least. Porcelain, beeswax, and even wood from the ship were carried off by treasure hunters and scavengers over the years. But Scott Williams, historian and executive director of the Maritime Archaeological Association in Astoria, says there have never been any official reports of gold, silver, or precious jewels like in the Goonies.
As soon as you say Spanish galleon, everyone thinks the Caribbean. They think the great Spanish treasure fleets sailing between Mexico and Florida. The Manila galleons didn't carry tons of gold or silver. They were carrying Asian luxury goods. So I always tell people this ship wasn't carrying gold. And then I get the occasional person who corrects me and says, clearly they were smuggling some kind of gold. And yeah, that's what the Spanish did. They smuggled goods so they didn't have to pay taxes on it. And Spanish nobles who'd made their fortune in the Philippines probably were smuggling the family fortune.
The Spanish were known for keeping records of their colonial exploits around the world. But they were also known for privateering, profiteering, and piracy, just like the British, Dutch, French, and Portuguese at the time. And with all this circular and triangular oceanic trade going on, plus the centuries-old indigenous trade routes through the interior of the Americas, Spanish artifacts and Spanish gold could have easily ended up further north in the mountainous backcountry beyond Pit Lake, or in the wilderness surrounding Bute Inlet. Heck, a Spanish galleon bound for Mexico ended up in Oregon. Why not in Bute Inlet? Why not somewhere where Slumach could eventually find it? We don't know if Charlie Mould knew about the legend of Neocani Mountain and the Santo Cristo de Burgos when he first told his sons about the Spanish mining for gold in British Columbia. We don't know if he truly believed that a Manila galleon loaded with gold sank in the frigid but otherwise calm waters of Bute Inlet where the Moulds lived. But we know that Charlie's son, Jack Mould, believed in the galleon and in Spanish gold. And he believed that Slumach, Walter Jackson, and Volcanic Brown had possibly found some of it. And he was sure that he would be the next. Throughout most of their lives, Charlie and Jack Mould searched for gold in the mountains and river valleys at the head of Bute Inlet, not 200 kilometers to the southeast in the area around Pit Lake, where Slumach's mine is rumored to be. In a 1993 video interview with writer, prospector, and former RCMP officer Donald Waite, part of the TV program Curse of the Lost Gold Mine, Jack Mould shared his theory behind Slumach's legend and mentions Walter Jackson, the alleged author of the Jackson Letter, considered to be the definitive treasure map to Slumach's lost gold mine. Quote, Jackson had been in there, and whether or not it was still Slumach's, we don't know. We've never found any clues that Slumach was in there, except for the pelvis of a 14-year-old Indian girl, way up in the mountains. That would be the only clue that would bring Slumach in, as far as I could see. But Jackson, yes, we know. End quote. No serious prospector in the pit leaves home without the Jackson letter, but Jack Mould was convinced that the map nor the gold had anything to do with the pit. One of the key pieces of evidence the letter talks about is the tent-shaped rock, under which Jackson buried some of the gold he found. Mould not only claimed to have found the tent-shaped rock, but he had it physically removed by helicopter. Quote, "The gold that Jackson had found is not in Pit Lake, that's for sure. We've proved that point, that there's no trace of gold anywhere in the headwaters of the pit or up the Pit River, or in any of those mountains up there. But we knew where the Spanish were, where Jackson was. We knew that we were sitting on a major gold find, probably the biggest one there will ever be in BC." End quote. Mould constantly scrambled the Spanish, Slumach, and Jackson stories into a 7-layer dip of intrigue and adventure, which brought him attention and investment. Facts be damned. He added to the slander of Slumach's name by stating unproven allegations of abducting and murdering women detailed last season. Fabrications, we believe, were made up by pulp magazine writers to scare and titillate the audience. Mould even brought volcanic brown to the area, hundreds of kilometers away from where he looked for gold and disappeared. Yet, he described finding his remains while on an expedition near Bute Inlet. Quote, "In there was a set of bones. One of the legs had a big scar on it, and his bones were deeply grooved from being quite husky as he grew, as he was younger. And we figured that was volcanics because the coroner said it was the same year that this person had died that coincided with Volcanic Brown's disappearance. When they found his cabin and cache, he realized that he took that from the tent-shaped rock and decided that he never went down in the creek, so left that there and went back to find the creek that Jackson talked about. And that's what we found in that canyon, is where we found those bones. So he never came back out the last time. When they looked for him, they never looked far enough north." End quote. In addition to claiming it was Spanish gold that Slumach and Jackson likely found around Bute Inlet and hauled it hundreds of kilometers to New Westminster, Mould also claimed that he found rock shelters and Spanish remains during a helicopter reconnaissance trip. Quote, "One set of bones was 200 years old and a little bit shorter than the average person, so we figured it could be Spanish, which would be in the 200-year bracket. And another set of bones was one leg bone I picked up. That's all I picked up. It was chewed on both ends, and I stuck it in my back pocket, and the coroner said something like 40-something years, so that was around the time the last guy went missing. It was below a 2,000-foot cliff. It was a few other bones around there with it, but no skull. It was never any skulls." End quote. On prospecting claims maps of the region that Mould filed with the provincial government, 2 mines were labeled Jackson's mines, and 4 so-called Slumach's mines are shown scattered around Southgate Peak, a mountain rising directly above the head of Bute Inlet, between the Homolko and Southgate rivers, which feed into the inlet. These mineral claims bolstered Mould's verbal claims, which helped him raise funds for multiple small investors, eager to share in Slumach's legendary lost treasure. Mould said that he spent some $200,000 over 30 years looking for, quote, "whatever his father thought might be out there," end quote. Then another $250,000 in the previous 5 years looking for gold that could possibly be attributed to Slumach, and another $200,000 in shareholder money. Quote, "If I don't get investors this year or the first part of next year, I'll finance it myself. So I'll never lose it, and we'll do the drilling ourselves in the spring. I believe we got people now that are gonna finance me, and we'll go to market for the winter and raise the capital to do the drilling." End quote. Mould attempted to convince a lot of people, including himself, that there's a true connection between the Pit region and Bute Inlet, though our research didn't turn up any major finds by Mould or his company during his decades of prospecting in Butte. Still, Mould continued to mine and fundraise with gossamer threads of Spanish and Slumach's gold woven through his ventures. And it didn't matter what he believed about Slumach's lost gold mine. He clearly saw value in his name. Quote, "We've got no reason to say it's Slumach's, but we did call our company Slumach Jackson because we still believe it's all the same." End quote. While Charlie and Jack Mould shared a belief in Spanish gold, their methods of finding it differed.
Never had, I think, a reputation that Jack did.
Judith Williams, author, visual artist, and professor emeritus at the University of British Columbia, has written extensively about the history and people of Bute Inlet. And she says that while both Moulds were treasure hunters, their ethics didn't align.
I mean, Jack's known to go into people's cabins when they're away and steal the stove, stuff like that. They were different guys. I've never heard terrible things said about Charlie.
According to Judith, Charlie Mould was known for being an industrious trapper, logger, and prospector. Over the years, not only did Jack Mould use Slumach, Jackson, and Spanish gold as he staked mining claims in the Bute Inlet area, he also became known for, shall we say, other pursuits.
Jack was in jail at various times in his life, and he was in Vancouver and in and out. He was always trying to sell interests in the mine, because how do you continue mining if you have no money? You have to find investors and things like that. And there's people who do this, as you know from the story about the whole gold seeking. There's people who want to do this, right? So people do invest in other people's things. So he was always trying to get money. And there is one story that I was told, and I believe it's true. And the story is that Jack was in Vancouver and he was in a pub there with a friend somewhere in Vancouver. And, you know, the beer parlors used to be real hangouts. And somebody came in and shot his friend. And the friend said, "Jack, I think I'm dying." Jack looked him over and said, "Yeah, I think you are." And he finished his beer and left, right? So there were stories like that he was a bit of what they say in English, a kind of wide boy, you know, that, out and about and not to be trusted. But, you know, people exaggerate and gossip terribly, you know how it is. And so I have to say these are stories I heard. I can't prove them.
Don Froese, the way-shower from our team of adventurers on the Dead Man's Curse television series, shares his suspicions of Jack Mould's methods. He says that Mould's gold fever and his disrespect for the people of the land he was prospecting may have been the source of his own undoing.
He did really good at building a fake business, but he ran into a problem when he included Slumach's name. So that's where the curse comes in. When he included Slumach's name into his company, and his attempt to go deep with the Slumach story, and that Slumach had come to the Butte and had found Spanish gold at the Butte, Jack had basically poked the curse by including Slumach's name. We're very careful when we talk about ones that have passed on in their spirit. We understand what backfire is. It's different than being ghosted. Jack Mould ended up going crazy and he ended up disappearing. He involved Slumach's ancestry, and there was so much energy. Like, he opened up a can of worms when he blew up Potato Beach, and he blew up that burial site, that ancestral place where the Homalco took their people and said their goodbyes. When he started messing around in there, that was the final straw right there.
Potato Point is a Homalco First Nations reserve at the north end of Bute Inlet, at an estuary where the glacier-fed Homalco River meets the inlet. You know, I went there to the blown-up burial sites with Taylor and Chief Darren, chief of the Homalco First Nation. We filmed there for season 1 of the TV series. Man, that was a traumatic experience. I'm not gonna lie. It broke me, standing there with the chief I'm holding a metal detector and I'm prospecting, I felt ashamed. I felt ashamed to be one of them, you know? But I now reflect back and I think to myself, it isn't the fact that you are a prospector, you're prospecting the land, it's how you do it. And I think this is the perspective that a lot of up-and-coming prospectors and treasure hunters need to hear, because you don't want to be remembered this way. Earlier, we mentioned that Jack Mould talked about finding human bones on one of his expeditions, but never any skulls. But on the cover of his quasi-memoir, Jack Mould and the Curse of Gold, published in 1993 and written by Elizabeth Hawkins, the cover of the book, with the subtitle, Slumach's Legend Lives On, features 2 skulls with chunks of what are supposed to be gold nuggets scattered in front. One of the skulls is roped in a hangman's noose, and a visual representation of Slumach's execution. And the skulls on the cover of the book appear to be real. Where they came from, we may never know for sure. But Taylor Starr, our truth seeker and researcher on Dead Man's Curse, and Don's daughter, believe the skulls are real and that Jack Mould took them from Potato Point.
It's crazy to think that he would go in there knowing and seeing burial boxes in the trees and blowing it up. In his book, on the front cover, there's some skulls and some gold and like a noose. And we believe that those skulls might have been brought from the burial ground as well. He used the skulls for the front cover of his book because those weren't fake skulls. Those were real skulls on the front of his book. So it's kind of put another like red flag, eerie feeling to us. He didn't care about anything other than the gold, and that probably just led him to his demise.
In fact, Judith Williams heard Jack Mould say something to that effect. She has lived near Bute Inlet for many years, and in most small places, she was bound to cross paths with him eventually. One day at a general store that carried his recently published biography, she ran into him after she had already written a few stories that were not flattering.
He came out, he's waving this book. He said, it's my book. I've got to buy it for a friend. So I engaged in a conversation like you do in a place like that. And he said that they'd all been up at Butte mining and they were just going out for the day. Or the boys were going out and he just went along for the ride, right, with his little dog and whatnot. And he started to talk about gold. He said, I've always wanted to find the gold. He said, all my life I wanted to find the gold. He said, I want the gold and I want the glory of finding the gold. So this is how he talked, right? And he was very gentle and kind, and he wasn't difficult. He might have been if he knew who I was. I don't know, but he was the opposite of everything I'd learned. But he was in a different situation, and I asked him about the book and things like that, and he certainly was sociable. Let's put it this way. And then they went off, and I sort of breathed a sigh of relief. I was thrilled to have met him because I'd never met him before.
About 3 weeks after their encounter, Judith read a story in the Campbell River Mirror that a hiker had a bad accident and people, including Jack Mould, had helped in the rescue. Then, a short while later, Judith read that Jack Mould had vanished without a trace. Jack Mould disappeared in September 2007 at age 71. His truck was found alongside the Southgate River with his dog and gun nearby. In the 1993 video interview, Don Waite asked him if he believed in the curse of Slumach's lost gold mine. Mould talks about several times when he slipped or fell down in the mountains, when lightning bolts struck equipment, when bad weather and bad luck showed up unexpectedly. He also says, quote, "When I first started, in the last 5 years, to me, a curse was nothing. I didn't believe in it. But as time went on, yes, definitely, I stronger and stronger believed that there had to be a curse. It's there. It's definitely there. Whether it's carelessness or what, but something's making it that way." End quote.
When Jack Mould disappeared, there was no celebration of his spirit because his spirit is gone. When Volcanic Brown disappeared, to this day, people are still searching.
The curse of Slumach's lost gold mine and the sorrow that befell the many others who went after it remain a mystery, a sometimes unpleasant one.
So someone made up a story about finding a skeleton up there, I don't know, and someone said that was Volcanic Brown's and it was proven not to be Volcanic Brown's. But what happened to the skeleton? Where's the skeleton? There's so much in this legend that is so separating fact from fiction. It's impossible to know.
That's next time on the final episode of this season of Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold. Thank you for joining me, and special thanks to Don Froese, Taylor Starr, Judith Williams, and Scott Williams for their work in this episode. Dead Man's Curse is hosted by myself, Kru Williams, and written by Ernest White II and Dila Velasquez. Our producers are Dila Velasquez and Jessica Young. Audio producers are Rosalind Kufor and Rob Johnston. Sound design by Rob Johnston. Our associate producer and Indigenous cultural and heritage consultant is Gail Starr. Our executive producers are Chris Duncombe, Ernest White II, Michael Francis, Kru Williams, Tim Hardy, and David Way. Dead Man's Curse is a production of Curious Cast, podcast for curious minds, and Great Pacific Media. For more information on this episode, follow us on social media, check out our website, and check out our show notes for additional information. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time on Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold.